So, I've made the entire Dutch Vandalin gang as LEGO minifigures. And this whole process did take a while. I believe I started in September of last year, and I only completed it in January. But yeah, I've just been slowly building up all of the figures. And while I was doing it, I did make a couple shorts on some of them. But now that I have them all, I'm just going to do one big video. I do love the game Red Dead Redemption 2. I have completed it twice. And I like LEGO, so I thought that I would also want to make all of them. But enough with a long-winded intro, let's just get into the actual figures. First up, we of course have the man himself, Dutch Vandalin. And this figure is pretty self-explanatory. A lot of people have made their own Dutch Vandalin, and most of them are relatively similar. So I don't really have too much to talk about them. Obviously, the torso is from Lord Vampire. The arms are from Grimhook. I used the legs from the old Han Solo, but you can also, of course, use the legs from this figure. Face from Whiplash, but I actually used the hairpiece from Gaston, just because I feel like it was the most accurate one. Otherwise, I don't really have too much to talk about. We also, of course, have Micah. Sorry, wrong figure. So, this Micah Bell was actually the first figure that I designed, and I am pretty proud of it. I think he is one of my favorite ones. But White Hat from the Lone Ranger, that was just a given. But his torso. So I used a torso from this Harry Potter, not because it was the most accurate, just because I felt like it looked the best. I was considering using the torso from this Michael Knight. It's okay, I just felt like it looked a bit too modern. And the legs I used from this Indiana Jones, I feel like those looked decent. But his face. His face was the hardest part, just because there isn't really a good handlebar mustache face. I only really had two other options. This one from Duke Boom, which is okay, I just wasn't a fan of the hair color nor the facial expression. And there was this one, which is probably the most accurate mustache. It's just, I wasn't a huge fan of it. So I chose this one from the Imperial Recruitment Officer. Not because it was the most accurate, just because I thought it felt the most like Micah. And the funny thing is, the perfect face does exist. It's this one, but it's on a yellow head, so I couldn't really use it. Now, my main man, Arthur Morgan. So this Arthur Morgan is pretty simple. He is based off of his base design. So yeah. So his torso is just a pretty simple LEGO City torso, but I think it works very well. The legs I used from this Han Solo. Obviously, I used the hair and hat combo from Indiana Jones, and I feel like this works pretty well. A lot of other people have also used this. And I know that his hat is a black one, but I feel like this brown one works fine. And his face. So I chose the face from Captain America from Infinity War. And I just personally prefer Arthur with a beard than clean shaven. I just think he looks better with one. But if you want your figure to be clean shaven, then you can either use the head from Jod or from this Indiana Jones. Obviously, his satchel and his revolver. But I mean, overall, I feel like he's pretty good. We, of course, have his brother-in-arms, John Marston. And I feel like this figure looks pretty good. For his hat, I used this hair and hat combo from Butch Cavendish, which I feel like looks very nice. It's just, the piece is kind of expensive. It goes for like $12, but I feel like it was worth it. In his face, I used the head from this Jason Malcolm, just because it had the stubble, a good facial expression, and some scarring. So I felt like it worked pretty well. And I used the torso from this Indiana Jones, because my basis was this design where he had a more brown jacket. And his legs I just used from this figure. We also, of course, have his son, Jack Marston. And I feel like this figure is okay. I used the head and hair from the most recent Young Anakin. And I know that his hair is a more brown, not really a dirty blonde. And I would use this hairpiece in brown if I could, but I just couldn't really find one. And I didn't really want to go out of my way to buy one. I used a torso from this sailor, but just with the normal blue arms. And I, of course, gave him his black gloves, some short legs in dark brown, and of course his scarf. And I know that his scarf is a more dark red, not a bright red. And a dark red scarf does exist, but it has only ever appeared on one figure, and none of the sellers I bought from had it. And I didn't really want to go out of my way just to buy one piece. But overall, I feel like this figure is decent. Now for Javier Escuella. So for Javier, I used this basis, and I feel like I did a decent job. First up, I of course have his classic poncho, and this poncho is from the Pinata Kid, but you can also use the ponchos from these figures. They all work perfectly fine. For his face, I used the head from this ACU guard, obviously classic bowler hats. And his legs, I actually used the legs from this Owen Grady. But for his torso, I chose the torso from this Harry Potter, and I just swapped out the hands. And of course, I gave him his revolver and his guitar. And if you want him without his hat, then I would recommend that you use this hairpiece, which I cannot find at the moment, but this is what he looks like. Now onto Bill Williamson. But for the figure, I used this design. So I chose the torso from this Harry Potter character, just because I noticed that Bill usually shows a lot of chest. I feel like this torso worked perfectly fine. And I used the hat from the Musketeer, just because Bill usually has one side folded up. And I give him this thicker beard piece, just because I couldn't find a good face print with a thicker beard, because most of them were pretty thin. But I feel like this one works perfectly fine. And I just gave him some dual molded legs. And if you use an actual beard piece, his face underneath isn't really going to matter too much. So for Hosea Matthews, I use a torso from this businessman, the legs from this jungle explorer, and just the face from the old Han Solo. But I'm not personally a huge fan of his face. I feel like this one from this figure just works a lot better, but the figure is kind of expensive, and the face alone was like $8, I think, and I didn't really want to spend that much, because I feel like this one works fine. And I wish that I could use some actual sleeves instead of normal arms, but the sleeves in the color I need are kind of expensive because they only ever appear on this figure, which came in a pretty big set. And I gave him the bandana from this figure, but one issue is that because of his hairpiece, his head actually cannot fully attach to the torso. Now onto my main man Charles. So for his face, I used the head from this figure, just because Charles does have some stubble, and this was the only good face with stubble. And I gave him the hairpiece from this Loki. I was originally going to use this hairpiece just because he usually has longer hair at the back, but I felt like from the front, this hairpiece looked better. And I used the legs from this Wild Style. In his torso, I actually used the one from this Kathy Dooley to replicate his blue shirt. And I'll be honest, I'm not super happy with my Lenny Summers, and that's mainly because of his face print. So Lenny has some facial hair, and I would have used the head from this Lando Calrissian. It's just, the headpiece is kind of expensive, and I didn't really want to pay too much. But I will eventually change it in the future. And for his hair, I used the hair from that same Lando, which is also appeared on other figures. But for his outfit, I chose this design with his overalls. And I used a torso from the Newspaper Kid, but I just gave him plain black legs. But I will eventually change that too. But I definitely feel like I could have done a bit better. But I am pretty happy with my Sean Maguire. I used this basis for him, and I feel like I did a pretty good job. I used a torso from this figure, and the same torso has appeared on a couple other figures. And I used the legs from this Owen Grady because of the belt and the holster. And obviously, I had to use this hair and hat combo from this Riddler because of the orange hair, and plus the green hat is accurate because Sean's hat is a bit more of a greenish color. And for his face, so I used the head from this Weasley, and I mean, this face is almost perfect. It has the correct hair color, skin color, a good facial expression, and a good amount of stubble. But the figure it came on released very, very recently, and no one was selling just the headpiece, so I had to buy the entire figure just to get the headpiece. I am also pretty happy with my Kieran Duffy. So for Kieran, I used the hair from this Kylo Ren, and I used the face from this figure. And the face, I feel like, is pretty good. It does have the correct hair color, beard type, and the facial expression. I feel like it's okay. I just wish that the face was maybe a bit more happy, or at least not so angry. And for his torso, I used the one from this Han Solo, but you can also use the one from this Han Solo or this one. And for his legs, I used the ones from this Jungle Explorer. But overall, I feel like this figure is pretty nice. I do feel like I also did a decent job on my Sadie Adler. I went with this design with her yellow shirt and overalls. So for torso, I used the one from this figure, and the legs from the old Han Solo. For face, I just used this pretty basic female face. It has appeared on multiple figures. And I used this hairpiece, which came on this figure. But I mean, otherwise, there's not really too much to talk about her. Now, onto Leopold Strauss. So for Strauss, I used this design. And for his face, I used the head from this Dumbledore because of the glasses, and plus the face just looks a bit older. But the eyebrows aren't entirely accurate. And I used a slick back hairpiece in light gray, and the torso from this detective. But I actually gave the figure the arms from this grip hook, and just plain black legs. Now for Josiah Trelawny. I feel like I did a pretty good job on Trelawny. I used this design, and I feel like the figure is pretty accurate. So for Trelawny, he has a blue undershirt with a black jacket. So I actually chose the torso from Butch Cavendish, and I feel like it looks pretty good. For his legs, I used the ones from this Weasley, and obviously I gave him this top hat. And for his face, I used the head from this figure. And I feel like it looks pretty good. The only issue is just that there is a second face. Now onto Pearson. So I used this design with his black sweater. And for sweater, I used the torso from this figure. And I just gave him dual molded legs. And for his face, I used the head from this figure. But for his hat, I just chose this bigger hat piece in black. And I'm not 100% happy with it. I do have this hat, which is a bit smaller and does have the accurate black band. It's just, I feel like it sits a bit too high on the minifigure's head. And if you want Pearson with his hair, then I would recommend that you use the hairpiece from this figure. We also, of course, have the lazy slime ball himself, Uncle. I feel like I did a pretty good job on him. I'll use the torso from this prospector with the legs from this farmer. And I just gave him this gray beard, which came on Galileo and a couple other figures. And I gave him the head from this figure, which I feel like works very nice. And for his hat, I actually gave him the hat from the Scarecrow, which I feel like works very well. I am also pretty proud of my Reverend Swanson. I used this design, and I feel like the figure looks pretty nice. I actually used the torso from this Harry Potter, but I gave the figure white sleeves. And I just gave the figure plain black legs. But I actually gave the figure the hairpiece from this figure. And I wish I could use this hairpiece, but this one just doesn't exist in orange. And for his face, I used the head from this figure. And I know that his mustache and eyebrows don't match his hair color, but otherwise the face is perfect. Now, onto Tilly Jackson. I feel like I did an okay job on Tilly. I just feel like I maybe could have done better. So I used the torso from Gabby Gabby with the arms from the newspaper kid, and I gave her the legs from this figure. But I gave her that skirt piece. Not because I wanted to, it's just, it was the only one that actually worked. Because sadly, this skirt piece just doesn't exist in yellow. So, yeah. I considered using this yellow slope, but I just didn't think it looked that good. And plus, it made the figure just too tall. So, I also used the skirt piece from Gabby Gabby. And I gave her the face from Monica Rambeau. And her hair is from this queen. But I am pretty happy with my Karen Jones. I used this design as a basis. And I gave her the torso from Elizabeth Turner with a plain dark red skirt. And I used this hairpiece from Nova and this female face, which came on this figure. And I feel like this figure does look pretty nice. And while an actual dark red skirt piece does exist, a plain one only ever came on this figure, and no one was really selling it. So I had to buy dark red skirts with printing on them, and then just erase it. I didn't bother erasing the back. Now for Molly O'Shea. I also used a plain dark red skirt, and I used this torso, which came on this figure, and I just gave her dark green arms, because I used this design. And I used this hairpiece from this queen, and just the face from Captain Carter. I mean, overall, I feel like she's okay. Now for Abigail Roberts. I am pretty proud of this figure. I used this design for Abigail Roberts, and I used the torso from this figure, and I just swapped out the arms. And I gave her a dark blue skirt. But a dark blue skirt doesn't actually exist, at least not one without printing. So I had to buy one with printing and just erase it. And I gave her the face from Agent Carter, and this hairpiece, which came with this figure. So for Mary Beth, I actually used this design as a basis. And I used torso from the Aristocrat, but actually the back of it. I gave her the hairpiece from Captain Carter, and the face from Hermione. And I also just gave her a dark red skirt. And finally, we have Susan Grimshaw. So I used this design as a basis, and I used the torso from the Trolley Witch, but I swapped out the arms. And I gave her this black skirt and this basic female hairpiece. And I used the face from this figure. So that is all of the figures. But would I recommend that you do this for yourself? No. Just no. That's because this cost way too much. I don't know how much this costs exactly, and I don't want to know, because I know it costs way too much. And I mean, if you do this for yourself, you could obviously improvise with parts you already have, but if you want to make them look as good as you can, you are most likely going to have to buy parts. That really adds up. And depending on how many of the parts you need you already have on hand, it could be cheaper, but still, I wouldn't really recommend it. I would only really recommend that you buy parts to make a couple of your favorite characters. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Bye.